Okay, welcome to everyone in person and those joining us online today. Please do let us know if you're having any trouble joining us online and we will sort that out, but everything has been thoroughly tested. We're not allowed to put the things down, the lights down until everyone's seated. Just a second, I promise. All right. Okay, everyone's been fantastic. What a wonderful audience we have today. I am thoroughly delighted and honoured to be introducing today's keynote speaker, Professor Conal McCarthy, who is Director of Museum and Heritage Studies at the Stout Research Centre, Tihiringawaka, Victoria University of Wellington. Conal's research and practice spans many disciplines, from museum and heritage studies to history, anthropology, sociology, and art history. Museum professionals and academics have been lucky to learn from his many publications, including Museum in Maori, the International Handbook of Museum Studies, Museum Practice, Curatopia, Museums and the Future of Curatorship, and Te Papa, Reinventing New Zealand's National Museum 1998 to 2018. Most recently, he has been working with Professor Anne Salmons on a Marsden Fund-supported project, Te Awahau, Transforming the World in New Zealand 1900 to 1950. Today, Conal will deliver a keynote lecture titled Learning from Pacific Museologies, Heritage, Culture and Environment in Moana Oceania. Please join me in welcoming him.
Ai kia ora tātou, kia ora ngā tātou katoa. Yoranga, Tarawhalawa, Malolelei, Ulavanaka, and warm Pacific greetings. Thank you, Nicole, for that introduction. Thanks to Jamie and Karen and everybody here at St Andrews for organising this wonderful conference. And I hope that what I have to say today will resonate with, echo, and complement the conversations we're going to be having about transnational island museologies. The Pacific Moana Oceania is a place that in the European imagination is peaceful, hence this strange term Pacific, and beautiful and far away. The reality, however, is somewhat different. The region is beset by all sorts of social and economic problems, not least in museums, and climate change is obviously one of those. The average height of islands in the Pacific Ocean is 2 meters. And by the end of this century, thanks to our failure to reduce emissions, sea levels will rise by 1 meter. So you can imagine the threat that that poses to life in the Pacific, not least to cultural heritage and the kinds of challenges that face people in the region. These are some of the places that I'll be talking about today, and it's been great at this conference to have contributions from people talking about the Pacific, Leilani talking about Tahiti, Karen talking about contemporary art in the Pacific, presentation this morning about New Caledonia. I'm going to talk about what's happening in the Pacific region, mainly to draw lessons from some of the ideas and concepts that are reshaping heritage management and museums. And first of all, I want to pick up on this idea that's been mentioned already from people like Epi Hauofa, the Tongan intellectual, about how we think about oceans and seas, how we think about the relationship between land and sea, people and things, nature and culture. I'm quoting from Epi Hauofa. There is a gulf of difference, he writes, between viewing the Pacific as islands in a far sea and a sea of islands. The first emphasises dry surfaces in a vast ocean far from the centres of power. When you focus in this way, you stress the smallness and the remoteness of the islands. The second is a more holistic perspective in which things are seen in the totality of their relationships. I have just used the term ocean peoples because our ancestors, writes Hauofa, who had lived in the Pacific for over 2,000 years, viewed their world as a sea of islands rather than islands in the sea. The world of our ancestors was a large sea full of places to explore, to make their homes in, to breed generations of seafarers like themselves. People raised in this environment were at home with the sea. They developed great skills for navigating their waters and the spirit to traverse even the few large gaps that separated the island groups. Theirs was a large world in which peoples and cultures moved and mingled unhindered by boundaries of the kind erected much later by imperial powers. Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Niue, Rotuma, Tokelau, Tuvalu, Kachina, and so on, formed a large exchange community in which wealth and people with their skills and arts circulated endlessly. Oceania is vast. Oceania is expanding. Oceania is hospitable and generous. Oceania is humanity rising from the depths of brine and regions of fire deeper still. Oceania is us. We are the sea, we are the ocean. We must wake up to this ancient truth and together use it to overturn all hegemonic views that aim ultimately to confine us again, physically and psychologically, in the tiny spaces which we have resisted accepting as our sole appointed place and from which we have recently liberated ourselves. So Haufa then really emphasizes the sea as something that connects us rather than separates us. And I think it's worth quoting that passage length. Haufa wrote a book called The Ocean in Us. And as a preface to that book, he asked one of his students, later a well-known poet and scholar of Pacific Studies at my university, Te Hawaka, Victoria University, who wrote these famous lines. We sweat and cry salt water so that we know the ocean is really in our blood. Other ideas of islandness and insular perspectives are being explored around the world as we speak, including at this conference, offering really interesting perspectives, I think, on cultural heritage, objects and collections, exhibitions and programs. Yeah. And Simon, who I've worked with quite a lot, New Zealand scholar, talks not about biodiversity, but cosmodiversity. She talks about experiments across worlds, particularly ontologies as well as epistemologies, ways of being, and the ways that these can shape how we manage heritage, how we run our museums and galleries. So the question I'm going to be asking as I run over a whole lot of examples of what's happening in the region is how some of these ideas coming out of what is increasingly being called Moana Oceania, the Pacific Ocean, are reshaping museums, galleries, and cultural heritage. All of us are dealing with this form of the modern museum, which, of course, emerged in the 18th century, collecting and exhibiting of a certain kind, being, in a sense, a Western invention. And in many cases, the museum, along with the nation state, modernity, imperialism, and colonization went together so that the West displayed the rest through this kind of frame of the museum, which is something that makes nations, makes people, makes culture, makes things. And yet in the later 20th century, we've seen various attempts to change the museum. And around the Pacific, we see in the late 20th century a number of spectacular new national museums, which in various ways have tried to change the ways in which they run. However, apart from spectacular architecture and design, exhibitions, policy and programs, the kinds of things front of house, it's been more difficult, I think, to see change happening within the museum in terms of the fundamental structures in which museums operate, particularly collections, management, and governance. And often I think we have to look outside these large national museums, which are often bound up in projects of nation making, to see much more fundamental changes taking place in the very form of the museum. And that's what I'll be looking at today. So in Anglophone museum studies in the last 30 years or so, under the rubric of the new museology, people have explored the post-museum, the new destination museum, etc., etc. Many different new forms of museology which have been explored. And of course, in Latin America and other parts of the world, there are the other traditions of museology, social museology, and so on, where people have been experimenting with different ways of setting up and running museums. I want to draw your attention particularly to the last name on that list, Christina Krebs, an American anthropologist who's worked a lot in Indonesia in the Southwest Pacific, and is really interested in the ways in which many peoples, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, long before museums were invented, had their own ways of collecting, exhibiting, preserving, and so on. So she talks about cross-cultural curation, she talks about liberating culture, she talks about appropriate museology. Her work is really interesting, and that's what I'm going to be picking up today. I'm involved with Christina in a project looking at what we're calling alternative museologies, in particular drawing on native, tribal, and indigenous traditions to explore ways in which these ideas and concepts are reshaping museum practice. So, in the talk today, I'm going to be briefly ranging over a little bit of history and theory, but mainly focusing on current professional practice. I'm going to be concentrating on concepts and models in particular. I'm going to briefly refer to the various kinds of issues and debates that are carrying on in the sector, in one Oceania, including things like repatriation. I'll be interested in engagement with the public, and particularly Indigenous communities, the transmission of knowledge. I'm looking at examples of GLAMs in general, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, not just museums, and heritage management. And one of the themes I think that comes through is the ways in which museums are attempting to move beyond the walls out into the environment and the landscape. There's a strong interest in intangible heritage. There's a strong interest in the natural environment and natural heritage. Many people know the region through these very famous, high-profile travelling exhibitions of Pacific art. There's been lots of examples going back into the 1980s, like the Tamari exhibition, which opened at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, recently Oceania from the Royal Academy in London. And while these have been very important, I think, for drawing attention to material culture from the region, there are perhaps issues with the aestheticization of these objects that were not necessarily made as art, being seen as art. Nevertheless, the exhibition that you can see there on the left, Tamari, had a transformative impact in the South Pacific from the 1980s. And this is a reminder, a la Christine Krebs project, that a lot of the innovations in museology in the English-speaking world, it seems to me, have come out of the Pacific. For example, with people like Hirini Moko-Mead, Professor of Māori Studies at Victoria University, who you can see here, who was the leading force behind the Tamari exhibition in the 1980s. And here he is at the Old National Museum, standing in front of the meeting house, Te Hauki Tūnga, the carved meeting house. And he argued in a journal article in 1983 that Māori and Polynesian people had their own models of museums which they should be looking at. And in particular, he advocated the meeting house, the ceremonial carved meeting house or community centre, as a model for museums. But there's an older history as well, which goes right back, I think, to the late 19th and early 20th century, which somewhat belies debates currently about decolonisation, post-colonial theory, and so on. A long-standing Indigenous interest in museums, in anthropology, in the value of ethnographic fieldwork, in the value of archives and collections. Here you can see, for example, in the 1920s and 30s in New Zealand, the revival of carving and the carved meeting house, led by Apira Ngata, who was a Māori lawyer, politician, and homegrown anthropologist. And you can see here the opening of the new meeting house at Ngāti Raukawa, Otaki near Wellington in 1936, and the way that the revival of arts and crafts, drawing from museum sources, sort of inspired by ethnological research, becomes a focus for tribal, social and cultural development. So after this opening, Apirana Ngata wrote a letter to his friend and colleague Rangihiroa, Peter Buck, who was the director of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. And this is what he said about the value of these kinds of things. Kua whiwhi rātou I te tāonga hei awhitanga mai rātou nākau, e whakahoki mai I te wairo o rātou tipuna, hei pūtahi o ngā whakaaro o ngā tautangariki I roto I te ao Pākehā. So he talks about material culture, things being taonga or treasures, resources. He sees it being an important meeting place for the community. He sees it reconnecting them with their ancestors. He sees it very much being about their identity in the Pākehā or European group. So this Indigenous engagement with museums and heritage then, I think, goes back a lot further than the 1980s. But the same kind of connection and networks are seen around Moana Oceania today. People refer to what's called the Indigenous International, this network of Pacific Islanders across the Pacific, the Trans-Pacific, if you like. Here, for example, at the East-West Centre at the University of Hawaii at Mount North, organised by Noel Kahanu. The Bishop Museum is involved. They get together people from across the Pacific and engage in training and professional development. Right in the centre there, you can see Teresa Vanadila from Fiji. So these networks are very strong and they've been around a long time. And people involved in this kind of training and professional development are very interested not only in learning mainstream museum skills, but also thinking about transforming, indigenising those skills and creating their own museums and cultural centres. Here's another example of a conference after the exhibition from the British Museum of Aboriginal Artefacts, which visited the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, an opportunity for Indigenous people from around the Pacific Rim to get together and talk about the similarities and differences in their experience and what they can learn from one another about where they're at with preserving and fostering their own culture. This is an image of Aina. Aina, the Samoan word for family, and this is an attempt to set up a Pacific Island professionals network. It is PIMA, the Pacific Island Museums Association, but this is a more recent innovation by Langi Mama, an academy and consultancy based in Auckland, where they brought professionals from the Museum of Samoa, the Wharematanga in Apia in Samoa, to the Auckland Museum and to Te Papa to pick up skills and learn how to look after their collections. You can see there in the foreground, Grace Hutton from Te Papa, who's a Cook Islander. On the right-hand side here, wearing this masi, is Nirmana Balram, who's a Fijian Indian conservator, working at Te Papa, very interested in issues to do with decolonising and indigenising conservation as practice. So a very strong kind of network across the Pacific, people helping one another and exploring options for what it is they do. I think another theme that comes across, if you look across the region, is although different in different places, although very context specific, very much related to the specific historical and social conditions in each location, there are parallels in different models of museums and galleries, collection organisations coming out of the region. So say, for example, in Australia, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have keeping places, which you can see on the left there, places where people do keep material culture and objects. On the right, you can see a museum in the Torres Strait Islands, which in many places don't look that much different from conventional museums. But sometimes quite different ideas are underlying a lot of these institutions. For example, the idea of country. This is Gilda Andrews, who works at the Australian National University in Canberra. Country is the concept that Indigenous Australians have, which is an overall idea of people and things, culture and nature, the whole of the natural environment, with a capital C. And this word country has become quite important in museums as a way of thinking about reassembling the relations between things that are often separated out in Western museum classification and categorization, bringing things together in this kind of holistic sort of sense of the world. Gilda also talks about the idea of the kinds of traditional land management practices that Aboriginal people do on country and applying that to museums. So just as Aboriginal people will go through the countryside, for example, and start fires to burn off the litter at the bottom of eucalypts and gum trees to stop wildfires. So Gilda talks about the idea of cool burning in museum collections. And it doesn't mean setting fire to museum collections. That means looking at cleaning, rationalizing, analyzing, and researching museum collections to try to work out where things come from and try to reassert a kind of an Indigenous perspective in the management and documentation of those collections. This is an exhibition that Gilda worked on called Great Southern Land, which is a really interesting kind of nature culture exhibition in Canberra. And there you can see this idea of country making its way into mainstream museum practice in Australia. It's a really spectacular exhibition, which I encourage you to visit if you get a chance, Australian Capital Territory. Other concepts across the region that have been influential in terms of people thinking about arts, culture and heritage. A lot of debate in the last 15 or 20 years about the concepts of tā and vā. There's a lot of literature on this and some references there. I can give you references later for a lot of this work. I'm really going to be referring to a lot of work that other people have done, citing them, invoking their voices today. So the book you can see on the right, Kolokesa Mahina Tuai, amongst others, wrote this book where they used this idea of the continuous nature of space and time in their work. And this idea of tā, vā has been quite influential in a lot of work in recent years. I'll talk a little bit more about that in relation to the Māori version of that, which is wā. Langi Mama and Kolokesa Mahina Tuai, who I mentioned before, put that concept of tā and vā into their work, often with institutions, but usually of sort of a bottom-up kind of approach, working closely with communities. So this is Pātaka, which is a cultural centre near Wellington in Purirua, and they worked with the Kiribati community to do an exhibition of timbuta, which are these textiles that women make that include the name of wearer. And this is a performance at the opening of the exhibition. Quite a strong focus on intangible cultural heritage in Kolokesa's work. If you look to the left there, you can see a figure in the exhibition, which is a climate change warrior. So this was one of the figures in the exhibition created by the community. And I'm going to read out the description from the catalogue of this figure. The exhibition is called Timbuta, Identifies Kiribati Woman, made by Kaitata Kaete Wilson and Louisa Humphrey. Otanahi, meaning sunrise, is a female Kiribati warrior facing hard times now with climate change, the sea around her rising, overfishing of her waters, entangled netting and plastics rubbishing her waters and her islands. But she looks at the rising of the sun each day with hope and is standing firmly with the light in her, with the fight in her to create a better world for our children's future. Our warrior is really speaking to our future generations as the guardians of this beautiful world we have. She's not just a warrior for Kiribati, but a warrior for the world. This is the Pacific exhibition at Te Papa, the National Museum in Wellington. It's called Tangata Ora Moana, curated by Sean Mellon. a really interesting curator and scholar who's an anthropologist who's written a lot about Pacific material culture and poses all sorts of challenges here, I think, in this exhibition. The beginning of the exhibition studiously avoids stereotypes of the Pacific. So he doesn't want to use hot colors. He doesn't want to have something dynamic and flowery and conventionally Pacific looking. He wanted something that was really cool, sophisticated, a contemporary work sculpted there by Felipe Torre up above, a 19th century waka or a canoe from the Cook Islands down below, but deliberately trying to refuse those European stereotypes of the Pacific. Secondly, what he did in this exhibition, you can see in the subtitle there, The Story of Pacific People in New Zealand. He's trying to present New Zealand as a Pacific island. He's trying to refuse the European notion of New Zealand as a European place so that people see New Zealand as a Pacific island and New Zealanders as Pacific Islanders. So he talks about Jacinda Ardern as the second Pacific, or the first Pacific Island woman to give birth while in office. Edmund Hillary, the first Pacific Islander to climb Mount Everest. The scientist Ernest Rutherford, the first Pacific Islander to split the atom. So he's really kind of challenging that national identity through really putting the Pacific at the centre. This is the catalogue associated with the book. A really interesting kind of experiment, very much interested in contemporary culture. Sean's work as a curator is very much involved with co-collecting, co-creating, co-governance, co-management, if you like, but has a very strong focus on contemporaneity and has banned the word tradition and traditional, inspired by the writing of Samoan writer Albert Wendt. Doesn't want people in the museum involved in any of the work to talk about culture being bounded and traditional, but rather something that is dynamic and changing. So a very strong kind of embrace of contemporary cultural reinvention, change, and adaptation. The place of Pacific Island people in Aotearoa in New Zealand is quite tricky, given that the nation's founding document signed in 1840 is the Treaty of Waitangi, which talks about Indigenous people, Māori people signing the treaty. And these days, the kind of interpretation of the treaty in terms of nationhood and identity is that we have tangata whenua, or the people of the land, and we have tangata tiriti, the people of the treaty. So Pākehā people like myself identify as tangata tiriti, people of the treaty. But where do you put Pacific Islanders in this? So according to the treaty, Pacific Islanders in New Zealand are tangata tiriti, people of the treaty, and yet they have this ancestral connection with Māori people through Hawaii, through Moana Oceania, that predates the treaty. So the politics of identity are quite. I really encourage you to read Sean Allen's work. He's a really interesting curator and scholar. Other models you can see around the Pacific, if you look at Christina Krebs's work or the book by Nick Stanley on Indigenous Museums of the Southwest Pacific, particularly places like Indonesia. You can see a museum there on the left in Kalimantan. You see, again, really interesting ways of adapting, adopting sort of aspects of Western museums, and then people applying their own kinds of notions of handling objects and displaying objects and looking after objects according to their own culture. On the right, you can see a really interesting example from Vanuatu of the Cultural Workers Program. And this involved, and lots of other people have written about the Cultural Workers Program, a really interesting example of people going out into the field and working with makers so that the museum's work is the maintenance, revitalisation of contemporary crafts and practices, not just the preservation of older examples of those things inside the walls of the museum. So that kind of outreach, cultural worker sort of idea of the museum in the Western Pacific, Melanesia. Leilani gave a really interesting example the other day of an eco-museum in Tahiti. So lots of different models in the Pacific. Here's another one from Samoa. This is not the National Museum of Samoa. This is a museum run by the Congregational Church. And interesting that it uses the form of the whare or house, whare matahana. Because the Pacific is beset by so many problems in terms of the climate, the preservation of objects, the lack of resources and staffing and money, and also the fact that much of the material culture of the region is not in the region any longer, but in Western museum collections. There's a very strong interest as a result of these factors in digital media. Despite the challenges of the lack of internet and the lack of digital capacity in the region. So this is the Virtual Pacific Museum, which is based in Wellington, but funded by the National Museum of Australia. And it's one way of addressing that challenge and thinking about the material culture of islands that are sinking under the waves and how people are going to preserve their memories and traditions in some kind of virtual form. But huge challenges with these digital options as well, I think, in terms of money and resources. The funding for the Virtual Pacific Museum runs out this month. So anyone's got a crop of gold at the end of the rainbow there and can help these people, let me know. Intense interest also within Aotearoa. A lot of Māori are really interested in digitised archives and collections. They're very interested in databases and they're very interested in finding out where things are and how they can get access to them. This is an example of a database associated with an exhibition called Kotawa, and it's related to the work of Paul Tapsell, you can see on the left there, who was the Māori director of the Auckland Museum. He's an academic and writer, now runs his own research consultancy called Takarangi Research. And in this exhibition at the Auckland Museum, it's been described as turning the museum inside out. So he argued that whereas traditionally in an exhibition setting, you have objects around the walls and the visitors walk through the space and look at the objects, in this exhibition he proposed to put the taonga, put the objects in the centre and have people walk around them, and using new media, audio and video, reconnected those objects with their ancestral landscapes, reinserting the objects back into country. So I think some of the interesting sort of ideas coming out of the region, in a book on climate change, the head of state of Samoa, Tui Atua Tutua Tamasese Isi Efi, encouraged readers to think like a fish, to try to see the world from the point of view of other beings. Paige Jones, Māori scholar, talked about the idea in Māori art of the Roru spiral, a double spiral, as an articulation of the Māori conception of space and time. So as we have tā and vā in Samoa and Tonga, so we have this notion of wā in the Māori world. So when we say inga wā or mua, when we talk about the past, we're talking about the space in front of us. And when we're talking about the future, inga wā or nui, we're talking about something that's behind us. So in this conception of the world, you walk into the future with your back turned to it and you look to the past. The opposite of that kind of European sense of the past and the future being before us and the past being behind us. So these different conceptions of space and time, which I think are quite productive. And Simon has talked quite a lot about the idea of whakapapa, genealogies or relatedness, and the way that these can be used in terms of environmental management. She describes whakapapa as a way of being based on complex networks that encompass all forms of life, interlinked and co-emergent, and how these frameworks might assist in exploring relational ways of understanding the interactions between people and the land, other life forms, waterways and the ocean, the idea of wā, of space-time, a continuous and present becoming future, and how all of this might help in devising non-linear, recursive ways of investigating the dynamic interactions among different life forms, including people. There's the Zhou spiral, the idea of a kind of a vortex or space and time sort of running out into the centre, unfolding as it were. And some also talks about the Māori story of the creation of the world, which was that in the beginning, the Sky Father Ranginui and the Earth Mother Papatuanuku were clasped together, and that the world was full of darkness, and that when they were separated by their children, particularly Tāne, who's the Atua or guardian of forests, trees which separate the sky and the earth, that brought light into the world, or what was called Te Ao Marama. So she talks about the tears of Ranginui, in fact, the title of the book. So she talks about rains, oceans, rivers, and so on, being the tears of Ranginui, the sky father. That idea of a spiral of time, the idea of whakapapa or relatedness, has inspired several contemporary models of various kinds for thinking about knowledge. So here, for example, is a recent model for data sovereignty. Here is a model for science, communication, and interpretation. Notice that it's basically the idea of a fern, a plant with roots and branches and so on. Where this ends up, I think, with museums and galleries is these concepts, these customary concepts, reshaping the internal functions of museums, particularly around things like collections. So these words have become kind of commonplace in local museums now: taonga, treasures or resources, and the idea of mana, authority, power, responsibility, tapu noa, the laws of tapu noa, which have been used to recategorize and separate things in museum collections according to the ideas of tapu noa, the idea of whakapapa, genealogy, and this term kaitiaki. So kaitiaki is to taki, to taki something is to look after something. So kaitiakitanga is a form of guardianship, a form of stewardship. So often curators, collection managers, and so on will refer to themselves as kaitiaki. And this word has also been applied to environmental management, where people refer to their work in the landscape as kaitiakitanga, as stewardship or guardianship of the land. So that's now quite commonplace in New Zealand museums and galleries, and has been, I guess, for 20 or 30 years. We find lots of experiments also with kind of internal museum practices at places like Te Papa, things like the co-management structure, the work of repatriation, which has been ongoing for 20 years more, policy developments like the policy of and so on and so forth. In contemporary art, interesting things happening as well. It was great to see Karen's talk today, talking about Kihara and other contemporary Pacific and artists in the region. I think in terms of curatorship, there's some quite interesting ideas coming through from people like Anna Marie White, who did a PhD in art history, and she talks about the idea of contemporary taonga. Her work is really interesting. She created a big exhibition of the work of Brett Graham, whose work is really extraordinary, engages very much with that dark and difficult colonial history. So I think there's these concepts coming through into all sorts of areas of contemporary museum and heritage practice. Just a word about natural history. So some museums have exhibitions that show quite interesting ideas about nature and culture, which try to incorporate Mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge alongside ideas of science. However, it's relatively kind of limited, I think, the extent to which this goes. And some people working in museums have become impatient with how slow-moving museums are in terms of dealing with the natural environment, the world outside the walls of the museum, and have left museums to work more directly with their people in the landscape, in the field. So here's some examples of work going on led by tribes, which is very much at the forefront of climate action. So the first one there, the Wanganui Regional Museum, a small museum in the regions, which is responding to the law passed a few years ago now, which recognises mountains and rivers as people. So the legal personhood of the Wanganui River and Mount Ruapehu, and I'll show you in a moment a really interesting exhibition which celebrates that. The local proverb, the pepeha there, ko te awa kuau, kuau ko te awa. I am the river and the river is me. So quite interesting things happening there, I think, in that space. Hannah Smith used to work with Te Papa, curator, artist, activist. She's now working with her tribe in farming and everything with sea rise and what have you, and is really interested in walking the funeral, as she puts it. So she's really focused, moved away, I think, from museums, objects and collections, and now very much thinking about taonga treasures as being the whole natural environment and really connecting with the land, with the whenua. The word whenua, meaning land, also refers to the placenta, from the whenua, people of the land. Lastly, Ngāti Toa, and when Jamie and Karen were in New Zealand in March doing their workshops, you heard from Ngāti Toa, a local tribe, who are engaged in this climate change project, which produced last month an exhibition, which I'll show you in a moment. So here's the exhibition at the Wanganui Regional Museum. The exhibition's on the right. The interesting thing about this exhibition, curated by Rawiri Tuni, though, is that the object labels refer to the object in the first person singular. So the taonga or the artifact will say, I am a canoe, blah, blah, blah. The other interesting thing to note is the big pile of paper in the left foreground, which was all of the material from their claim to the Waitangi Tribunal. So the Waitangi Tribunal examines claims of breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi, and they're displaying, in a sense, their activism or their struggle to regain control of the river and their natural resources. This is the exhibition at Pātaka that Ngāti Toa produced as part of their Te Ara o Raukawa Moana project. So you can see there the South Island on the left, Te Waipounamu, the North Island on the right, Te Kaunāwi, and Raukawa Moana is cooked straight in between the two islands. And this project involves researching the waterways and the land and reconnecting particularly the young people in the tribe to their culture through this project. That work, of course, also is political and very much involves activism. So just a few weeks ago, Ngāti Toa went to Parliament to protest the work of our ghastly new right-wing government, who have been in power for about 6 months and who are busy enacting legislation, fast-tracking legislation, which is putting the environment at risk, very much kind of anti-treaty and so on. So Ngāti Toa, along with many other tribes, are very actively involved in resisting this work. Finally, a lot of these iwi-led or tribal-led projects, which combine things like design, exhibitions, heritage, museums, and so on, often involve green buildings. So at my university, the Living Pa will open at the end of this year, which is a green building for the new Māori Studies program. This is Te Wharekura, which I guess is a cultural centre for the Tūhoe people in the Taone Atua region, and very much a kind of a hub for everything that's happening locally. And just to finish, I guess the question that I would pose given that this is an ecophon gathering, what are the implications of a lot of these developments in the sector, in practice, for theory and for the teaching of museum studies and museology? And a couple of years ago, Karen and Bruno and co put together a session on decolonising the curriculum. The Ngāti Toa people have asked us to develop a course for them in preparation for building their cultural centre. So these are the things that we're thinking about very much at the moment, is how our teaching and research can help them with their development, their social and cultural development, and their new tribal cultural centre. So hopefully there's something in there for you to chew on, and I'm very happy now to make any questions. Got it, Kate?
Thank you very much, Conal, for that absolutely stimulating presentation. We're now open to questions. Can I ask if you're online, if you'd like to put your question into the question box? And if anyone here has a question, please do raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you so our online participants can hear the discussion. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Nina. I'm from St Andrews. I'm a geographer. And I loved your presentation. Thank you so much. For those of us who aren't familiar with a lot of this, fantastic for the board. I'm interested in that concept of the sort of the sea and that being the view of land and islands. But I'm just sort of thinking in the broader sense of the Pacific and, you know, what's called the Pacific Rim as well. And I work in Peru and that part of Latin America, and I was just sort of thinking about the indigenous understanding of space and time, and you've described them are very similar to the ones I'm familiar with in the Andean region. So I was just thinking about how to push a bit further and extend into the hinterland of the bigger land masses. So if you know if the islands are being reconsidered as what is an island, then how about those connected spaces of hinterlands that colonial imaginaries have seen as coast mountains and jungle, but that have always been connected in Guatemala, in Peru, in Ecuador. So I'm just wondering about how those understandings of relational space and time as being a bigger geography of the sea could, whether that's relevant or not.
Yeah, I guess the value, you're quite right, the value is putting through those bounded notions of geography of land and sea. So we showed examples from Australia today, which is a continent. You could say it's not an island, but I mean, in many ways, you know, the whole idea of island is that, and rethinking how the Sea of Islands makes us rethink all of those kinds of things. There's a really interesting book about the Trans-Pacific by a couple of anthropologists from Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Ellen Duer and Philip Sorsch, and they talk about this idea of the Trans-Pacific connecting in ways that we don't necessarily kind of think, and particularly with connections with Latin America, with you know, North and South America. So yeah, I can't offer too much more than that at the moment, but maybe if I give you my card, I can pass on a few references of people that are exploring kind of implications to geography.
So thank you very much, Conal, for your excellent presentation. It's great to see all the various progress and different kinds of projects that are being led across the Pacific. My question is actually about objects of mana. I want to know if there's been input for innovative approaches to displaying objects as alive, as sacred, and how, since this is a museum conference, how that kind of thing can be better represented and contextualized.
Thanks, Leilani. Yeah, a lot of work on this. I think one of the kind of first kind of areas of change from the 1980s was with collection care, management, documentation, and handling. And when people think of artifacts as living object beings, as fauna, as ancestors, that necessarily affects the way that they're stored, handled, referred to, including the thesaurus that's used to describe them in the CMS, the content management system. It affects lots of different ways of organising collection stores, moving things around, and that really gets at the kind of core museum kind of function back of house, I think. So a lot of work on that. Some strong similarities, but also some key differences in different parts of the Pacific, I think. But if you have a look at some of the writing on Māori museology, Māori and particularly collection, for example, there's a new collection coming out from UCL ePress, edited by Cara Krimpotich and Al Stevenson, and there are some really interesting chapters in that on from Hawaii and New Zealand on how people have indigenized collection management.
Yes. Thanks, thanks, Conal, for your song. I was really interested by the concept that you used of the museum beyond the wall. That's something that really struck me in the Pacific, the way that the gardens and the spaces around the museum are also included as important spaces for life, for creations, for different workshops or things like that. Can you comment a little bit on that and the different kinds of things that you observed around different regions?
Sure, yeah. So that museum beyond the walls thing, it's just a phrase I kind of used. I was trying to avoid the musée imaginaire kind of, version of that, which I guess is quite different. But in some cases, it sort of describes outreach activities, where the museum is the work that's done in communities with people maintaining and reviving practices, and often using museum objects as models of inspiration for those ongoing practices. In some cases, it's kind of linking up with those ideas in geography of cultural landscapes, of thinking increasingly of not of buildings and landscapes as discrete things, but of the curtilage, the contiguous spaces around things. So thinking of heritage as gardens and mountains and seas and in that kind of really contiguous kind of way. And museums are kind of a strange thing when you think about heritage in those broader, extensive terms, because they're these buildings that lock things up inside them and separate them from those ancestral landscapes, from those ongoing cultural practices, from the work that they do in communities or in the natural world. So museums, I think, in the region are trying to reach out and do those things. There are probably limits to what they can do. And that's why it's really interesting to look at these Indigenous-led cultural centres, whare taonga, keeping places and so on, because in many cases they're very pragmatic about what it is they want to do, and they're quite happy to abandon and ditch any aspect of museology or conventional museum practice that doesn't suit them and that doesn't meet their needs. So you get quite a lot of convergence, co-location and integration going on. You get convergence of GLAMs, for example. In the regions, you might have a shop, an information centre, a theatre, a gallery, being mushed together into one kind of thing. And as far as tribes are concerned, they don't have any qualms necessarily about putting things together in a way that is going to work for them. So their cultural centres often, I think, trying to open out into the landscape around them in various kinds of ways. Although there are limits to which you can do that in a physical building with bricks and mortar. So people are hence very attracted to the idea of digital, because they see that being more kind of flexible. There's a lot of Māori and Pacific Islands digital projects, but there are problems that come with it as well in terms of resourcing. Often those projects are led by tech pros who are very interested in the technology, but don't necessarily have a sense of audience engagement. The platforms are often very ephemeral, they change very quickly. So there's problems with that. But you can see, I think, in all of those experiments and attempts to do things, a different conception of the museum. And Aratata Wise, the co-host of Te Papa, he often says that we have to look to see what our communities want from us. And sometimes they'll want things that we can't provide them with, but we have to figure out how we can support their tribal cultural development, their aspirations. Otherwise, we're going to be irrelevant. And that often means plan B, which is repatriation and getting those taonga back from those museums so those people can do, what they want themselves without the museum necessarily interfering. So that's again, it's been a debate over sort of 30 years or so. If museums can't change quickly enough and partner with tribes to give access to their talent and help them do what it is they want to do, then they're very quickly going to be left behind, and they'll be doing their own thing. And I have to say, it's quite different in different parts of the country and in different islands around the region. Some iwi have settled their treaty claims and have got resources, cultural redress, and have got money to develop their own cultural heritage projects, are quite happy to leave their objects in the museum because they're paying the power bills. They're looking after the stuff, and they just go in and get their stuff when they want to. They borrow it, they loan it, they go and use it, and then they put it back in the museum. So some people are quite pragmatic and quite happy to stick with the existing status quo as long as it works for them.
First of all, thank you so much for fulfilling all of our expectations about what you would deliver today. As keynote speaker, we're really delighted. Thank you. It's a quick question. You began your talk with slides on climate change and the impacts of climate change. And then at one point you were talking about paradigm shifts in museum studies with a list of authors, many of whom worked on museum education, broadly speaking. And I'm just wondering that now you've chosen to work with Christina's Krebs on, for want of a better term, indigenizing museology. So I'm just wondering why now? Why that? Why now? And is there a link between that and the current climate emergency, as you see it, from your regional perspective?
Thanks. I think one of the things that's coming out of this conference is the need to pair cultural heritage initiatives with climate action, and you can't have cultural heritage justice without climate justice and so on and so forth. I mentioned to someone yesterday, I think that David Harvey's done this really interesting article on decolonisation and decarbonisation, and arguing that the two need to sort of go together. And decolonisation probably is a higher profile, and we need more work on decarbonisation. But I think, can you remind me of what your question was?
It was really just, looking through the chronology of paradigm shift in museum studies, why is it an indigenous moment? Did you see it? Or?
There were 6 people involved in this project. And I think for all of us, from where we're coming from, we really see the need at the moment for a historical analysis. And there's a lot of focus on contemporary practice, which is really important. There's probably too much theorising. And there's a lot of presentism. And we all think that there are lessons from the past in the Indigenous engagement with museums and heritage, which provide fruitful models for the present, particularly things like tribal development, that need to be recovered and sort of reconnected with contemporary practitioners. And so there's quite a lot of amnesia, I would say. So that's one of the reasons why I think that historical perspective pushes out our history of the engagement with the museum form and the kinds of debates we're talking about much further. It provides a richer source and pool of things that, for example, we can do with our teaching. We need readers and texts like this in our teaching so that the next generation of professionals who are going to be working in this world are prepared, ready to deal with these issues. So it needs to be sort of fed back into the literature in a way, I think. So that's why we need that kind of alternative museologies kind of reader project now.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Can you join me in thanking Professor McCarthy?